The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
The freedom of a people to choose its leaders is the root of liberty.
Keep alive this experiment in liberty.
Liberty, in case you've forgotten, is the soul's right to breathe.
Government should be very minimal in protecting liberty.
Peace cannot be purchased at the cost of liberty.
The sturdy ground of liberty.
Liberty once lost is lost forever.
Fight for their liberty and for our security.
Guarantees individual liberty.
This great republic, born alone in liberty.
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 Liberty. Liberty.
Just how much do you want liberty?
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner,
a production of LibertyNation.com.
Cutting through the double talk, taking on the topics, going after what the politicians really mean, and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Mueller time is over. Trump is cleared. His presidency renewed. So what happens now? Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. Far from putting the humiliation of the Mueller report and William Barr memo behind them, Democrats and their cohorts in the elite media are doubling down, focusing on obstruction of justice and refusing to move on, somehow believing that America wants endless additional investigations of Donald Trump. Meanwhile, Jussie Smollett is freed by the state's attorney in Chicago despite 16 felony counts against him. And Michael Avenatti is busted on charges of extortion and a bunch of other felonies. Scott Cosenza will join us to discuss both the aftermath of the Mueller report and the Smollett and Avenatti cases. And Victor Davis Hanson is back to discuss his new book, The Case for Trump.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
We kick things off with our signature segment, Say What, where we roll out some of the most wacky, astonishing, and damnable things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. So after a 2-year investigation which polarized the nation and paralyzed the Trump presidency, Trump-Russia collusion has been fully and finally debunked. Or has it? One of Trump's leading tormentors, Congressman Eric Swalwell, on both the Judicial and Intelligence Committees, was sure there was collusion before the Mueller report came out, and he, along with many of his leftist colleagues, still aren't ready to move on after an investigation which incorporated 2,800 subpoenas, 500 interviews, and some $30 million, give or take. Listen to what Swalwell said on CNN before and then after the report.
I've seen plenty of evidence of collusion. We have very good circumstantial evidence that the Trump team, the family, the businesses were eager to work and were working with the Russians while the Russians were helping them. And I think in the court of law, that's enough. Just because you are criminally a non-colluder doesn't mean that we don't want to know what evidence Bob Mueller found about efforts you and your team and your family and your business took to work with the Russians.
As Democrats decide just how far to push with more and more investigations of Trump following this watershed moment, the leftist elite media is now being held to account for the endless attention and alarmism they indulged in. And when Trump's lawyer Rudy Giuliani went on CNN with Chris Cuomo, he laid bare first the politically active investigators appointed by Mueller and then the media's collusion delusion.
He's got a staff of at least 8 people who were rabid partisan Democrats. Never should have been on that staff. One of them was the counsel to the Clinton Foundation. Suppose I was investigating Hillary Clinton with the counsel to the Trump Foundation. He had a lead investigator who is all over the text saying he hated Trump. That's disgraceful. You guys on this network
what have I done?
Have tortured this man for 2 years with collusion, and nobody's apologized.
First of all,
so before we talk about obstruction, apologize for the overreaction of collusion.
Not a chance.
Well, of course you're not.
Not a chance.
Of course you're not, because you're not being fair.
No, please. You know better than that, or you wouldn't be here.
No, I don't know better. I am outraged by the behavior of these networks.
Okay.
Collusion.
The respected liberal investigative journalist Glenn Greenwald, co-founder of The Intercept, said on the Democracy Now! Podcast that the media's performance in the collusion delusion was disgraceful.
This is the saddest media spectacle I've ever seen since I began practicing journalism in 2005. And what makes it even sadder is to watch all of the people who vested their journalistic credibility into what proved to be a complete and total fraud and scam continue to try and cling to some vestige of credibility by continuing to spin conspiracy theories that are even more reckless and more unhinged than the ones to which we've been subjected for 3 years. The great journalist and writer Matt Taibbi wrote in an article over the weekend, and I agree with him completely, that as humiliating as the media debacle was leading up to the Iraq War, what they did over the last 3 years in the Trump-Russia story makes all of that look like a pimple. It's ratcheted up tensions between the two most dangerous nuclear-armed powers in the world, Russia and the United States, that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists says has brought us to 2 minutes before midnight on their doomsday clock. So it's also been extremely dangerous in ways that we don't yet know.
But if you thought the Mueller report is the end of the left's single-minded attempts to overthrow the results of the 2016 election by whatever means avail themselves, think again. At least 6 different committees, maybe as many as 9, are planning to investigate President Trump. But when Trump went on Fox News for his first interview after the investigation was over, he made it clear that he is now planning to publicly release the documents like the FISA warrant based on the discredited Trump-Russia dossier that formed the very basis for the investigations of Trump both before and after the election.
I have plans to declassify and release. I have plans to absolutely release, but I have some very talented people working for me, lawyers, and they really didn't want me to do it early on. One of the reasons that my lawyers didn't want me to do it is they said, if I do it, they'll call it a form of obstruction. So they'll say, oh, you released these documents. So we would make all of this information transparent. You know, in politics, you always hear transparency. Would make it transparent, and then they'd call it obstruction, knowing the people we're dealing with. So, frankly, I thought it would be better if we held it to the end. No, but at the right time, we will be absolutely releasing.
So if Democrats think they can continue to advance scurrilous charges against Trump, the president will fight back with the fresh ammunition of his innocence on the charges of collusion and the obvious culpability of the Obama Justice Department in ginning this whole thing up. Meanwhile, a breathtaking development in Chicago where the state's attorney decided to drop the 16 felony charges against TV actor Jussie Smollett after Smollett personally orchestrated a fake hate crime against him by phantom Trump supporters. And they did this while admitting he did everything he was charged with, leading Smollett to claim vindication and leading the head of Chicago's Fraternal Order of Police, Kevin Graham, to cry foul.
This has been an incredibly difficult time, honestly one of the worst of my entire life. But I am a man of faith, and I'm a man that has knowledge of my history, and I would not bring my family, our lives, or the movement through a fire like this. I just wouldn't. Make no mistakes, I will always continue to fight for the justice, equality, and betterment of marginalized people everywhere.
It's a disgrace. It's a disgrace to the police officers that worked so hard. These detectives knocked their socks off. They worked that case, and all they got for their hard work was told, no, we're going to let them go.
We'll talk more about the Jussie Smollett case a bit later on with LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza. Now, as Joe Biden considers another run for president in the crowded Democratic field, the former vice president established perhaps a new low for pandering and political correctness in renouncing his own heritage as he apologized for his behavior in the Clarence Thomas Supreme Court confirmation hearing 30 years ago, particularly regarding the black woman who made entirely uncorroborated charges of sexual abuse against Thomas, Anita Hill.
She was abused through the hearing. She was taken advantage of. Her reputation was attacked. I wish I could have done something. I opposed Clarence Thomas' nomination. I voted against him. But I also realized there was a real and perceived problem the committee faced. There were a bunch of white guys No, I mean it sincerely. A bunch of white guys. To this day, I regret I couldn't come up with a way to get her the kind of hearing she deserved. Nearly 30 years later, and I publicly apologized to Anita because she didn't get the hearing she deserved. We all have an obligation to do nothing less than change the culture in this country. A white man's culture. It's got to change.
That may be the most craven, insincere, slobbering, pandering political statement I personally have ever heard. And there's a lot of competition. We close with one of the most amusing stunts we've ever witnessed in the United States Senate. It came during the debate over the Green New Deal, which was rejected 57-0, with 43 Democrats voting present, including senators running for president who publicly supported the Green New Deal. But the show was put on by Republican Senator Mike Lee, who used visual aids to, as he said, treat the Green New Deal with the seriousness it deserves, advocating for space lizards and giant seahorses.
These hairy bipedal species of space lizards offer their own unique benefits. Not only are tauntauns carbon neutral, but according to a report a long time ago and issued far, far away, they may even be fully recyclable. I draw your attention, Mr. President, to the 20-foot impressive seahorse he's riding. Under the Green New Deal, this is probably Hawaii's best bet. Now, I'm the first to admit that a massive fleet of giant, highly trained seahorses would be cool. It would be really, really awesome.
Hey, if we get rid of airplanes as the Green New Deal would do, what other options would we have than space lizards and giant seahorses? That was the culmination of what was the week from hell for Democrats. Quick break, and then we're back to discuss the aftermath of the Mueller report and William Barr memo with LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Exhausted by all the fake news? On LibertyNation.com's YouTube channel, facts and fresh, bold analysis are what you get without the leftist spin. Subscribe today to the LibertyNation.com YouTube channel because
Truth
is making a comeback.
We believe that all men are entitled to blessings of liberty.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
It was the political equivalent of Al Capone's vault, offering endless promise to those who expected a treasure trove to materialize, but it never did. And now, after a 675-day investigation, on top of 3 previous investigations by the FBI and the House and the Senate, Donald Trump is in the clear on Russian collusion, and the left, along with their handmaidens in the establishment media who reported on this breathlessly for 2 years, are left empty-handed and humiliated. Joining us to analyze the Mueller report and its aftermath is LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Tim. And once again, the biggest loser, as with Capone, is Geraldo Rivera.
Yeah. He's the common thread between those two stories. So, Scott, they spent $30 million on Russian collusion, and all the Democrats got was not even a lousy T-shirt, but this lousy no collusion decision. But Democrats continue to cling to Mueller's refusal to offer a recommendation on the issue of obstruction of justice. How far do you think they can take this? And how far might they go with their claims that Attorney General Barr covered for Trump and can't be trusted in his decision not to bring obstruction charges against the president?
If we look at the Barr memo to Congress that he released him, it's actually, I would get a little more nuanced with that and say it's not that he refused to issue obstruction charges. He said that the necessary requirement, right, including an intent element, an intent to obstruct, and the evidence to prove that were not present. There is no evidence to support such a charge as what the Attorney General said. So that is, I think, a much more powerful statement in Donald Trump's interests than some just sort of I'm not willing to or to go with the more nuanced analysis about how a sitting president may not be able to be indicted. No, that's not what we have here. We have William Barr is saying, and in fact, not only is William Barr saying, but if we believe the contents of his letter, Mr. Rod Rosenstein himself is also saying that if this were just John Q. Public, not the President of the United States or Donald Trump, the evidence that we have does not support an obstruction charge.
Okay, now almost every element of this Mueller report has been discussed since its release several days ago. But one of the things that's been overlooked in the aftermath is the tactics that Mueller's investigative team used on Michael Flynn and Roger Stone and probably others, treated them like drug lords or hardened criminals. They conducted over-the-top raids with helicopters and dogs and amphibious vehicles. Did it not remind you of what would happen in a tin-horn dictatorship?
Tim, it would if I didn't know that federal law enforcement authorities use these kinds of tactics when it weren't their political enemies they were after, but just their law enforcement enemies they were after. Sadly, the state of law enforcement is this increased militarization, which we should oppose for all the reasons why it's odious in this instance. Overkill, unnecessary. It doesn't look like justice so much as an invading army.
So many lives were ruined by this blatantly partisan investigation. Was it appropriate that so many of Mueller's operatives were not just registered Democrats, but politically active Democrats who had contributed to Obama and or Hillary Clinton? Is that appropriate?
No, Tim, it's not appropriate. It shouldn't happen. And people who are that involved in politics should not be a part of an investigation of a political, at this high level of the opposite party.
Now, Scott, when we finally get to see the actual Mueller report as opposed to the summary letter from Attorney General William Barr, what we will see will undoubtedly include redactions for national security, grand jury testimony, perhaps executive privilege. Give us a sense of when we might see what we're allowed to see and how abridged it will probably be by that time.
That's a tough question to answer, Tim, only because we don't know precisely what the administration will ask for. They have the capacity to ask for the entirety of the report to be allowed, which is to say they can ask a judge that even though the general rules require grand jury testimony to be secret, in this special case, they can ask for a relaxation of those rules to be published. That's what I would prefer, given, I think, for everyone who monitors the sort of political chatter. No one on the sort of far left is going to be satisfied until Gerald Nadler's not going to be satisfied until there's not a single punctuation mark left unrevealed.
That's LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza, who will rejoin us a bit later to discuss Jussie Smollett and Michael Avenatti. But up next, Victor Davis Hanson and the case for Trump.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Exhausted by all the fake news? On LibertyNation.com's YouTube channel, facts and fresh, bold analysis are what you get without the leftist spin. Subscribe today to the LibertyNation.com YouTube channel because
Truth
is
making
a comeback.
We believe that all men are entitled to blessings of liberty.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
The Case for Trump. That's the title of a new book by the great Victor Davis Hanson, in which he lays out the intellectual foundation for the disruptive Trump presidency. We played the first part of our interview with Mr. Hanson last week, and now part two. I asked him whether those stubborn, never-Trump Republicans like George Will and Bill Kristol were or still are relevant.
They weren't relevant in the sense of politics. They have one advantage, and that is to a particular 3 to 4% of suburban voters or married women or single women voters who occasionally vote Republican. They appeal to them, and that has hurt Trump. And the other thing they do is, I can tell you, as somebody wrote this book and was just called a Nazi and a Martin Heidegger-like toady to Trump as Hitler by Gabriel Schoenfeld and the new Bill Kristol Bulwark. They try to incite. They're very bitter, and that they're trying to sow dissension or anger among the Trump traditional supporters. And they're sort of spoilers, court gestures. They're full of anger, and I think part of it is these were the coastal establishment figures, the columnists, the insiders, the handlers, the politicos that usually go to the White House. They go on TV. They're part, and they feel that they've been alienated or ostracized from a Republican source of power and influence, and they're very angry. They look at Trump in careerist terms as opportunities that were closed to them. And a lot of them have actually tried to apologize and find their way back into the halls of power, and Trump has a long memory, and that's made him even angrier.
Indeed. Let's talk about the Democrats a bit. They wrote off Trump in 2016. They were certain they would beat him, probably in a landslide. Do they now believe he's a true force to be reckoned with, someone who will be hard to beat in 2020? Or do you think they remain as confident of victory as they were in 2016?
Oh, I think they've learned nothing, to quote Talleyrand, they've learned nothing and forgotten nothing. I think they think 2016 was just an aberration, and they're going to go hard progressive like McGovern did in 72 or Walter Mondale did in 84, and this time they're going to win. That Trump, because he's controversial, he tweets, just as he did, and they don't just take a deep breath, as I point out in the book, and say, you know what, his polls right now are about what Obama's and Clinton's were at this time. He did better in the House than they did in the midterms. He did much better in the Senate than they did in the first midterms, and they both pretty much clobbered their re-election opponent, respectively, Bob Dole and Mitt Romney, and so they don't understand that really this 2020 election is Trump's to win or lose himself. And if they nominate someone who's going to run or get tagged with reparations and infanticide as permissible abortion, the new Green Deal, wealth tax, 90% income tax rate on top rates, abolishing ICE, abolishing electoral college, and I could go on, Medicare for all and all that. Those are not 51% issues, so to speak, and they would be very hard for a candidate, to say this is the future of America. Whereas Donald Trump's going to say, you're a 3% GDP on an annualized basis that I got you, and record low unemployment and energy production is one choice, and socialism is the other.
Right. It's still the economy, stupid, isn't it?
I think it is.
Well, we'll find out next year to be sure whether that time-tested truism continues to be true. As we continue with Victor Davis Hanson, author of The Case for Trump. Trump's election, Mr. Hanson, was obviously a shock to the system, not just here, but around the world. What do you suspect world leaders really make of him, whether it's in Europe, Middle East, Asia, Russia, China, North Korea, and the way that he's toppled traditional American foreign policy? Do they largely applaud him, fear him, what?
That's a very good question, and I've been very lucky at the Hoover Institution because we have access to visiting journalists and dignitaries that stop by on their way to the West Coast, especially from Asia. And I've noticed something in the last 2 years, that publicly they're appalled by Trump, and they say that he's not working within existing post-war institutions, or he's too crude or crass or too mercurial. But when you get them off the record in private conversations, then the reaction is very different, and it's more or less I think now somebody's standing up to China, and had you not stood up to China and you were Taiwan or South Korea or Japan or Australia or Philippines or Vietnam, there was a sense that Obama was not protecting you or would not back you, and it was inevitable you had to cut a deal with China. Or if you were in Europe, you just understood that you had no mechanism for even daring to challenge Chinese mercantilism. Or if you talk to Europeans, they'll kind of shrug and they'll kind of smile off the record and say, yeah, we really didn't have any intention of paying 2% GDP, investing in defense, and we just thought you guys wouldn't care. Or when you talk about certain people in the Middle East, they'll tell you off the record, well, we didn't understand why you ever got into that Iran deal. Or you talk to certain Europeans, or even, especially in Asia, why did you, I mean, everybody knows the Paris Climate Accords kind of a joke. What was that? Why did you ever get involved with Obama like that? But not publicly is what I'm getting at. Not publicly.
Right.
It's among that establishment class, it's still a career hazard to say that in any way, sort of like when I wrote the book, an example, a parallel example is writing the book and then being on a plane the other day, and a guy taps me on the shoulder and said, "Are you the guy that wrote this book?" And he had the book. And I said, "Yes." "Would you sign it?" "Yes." And then he kind of smiles at me and puts it under his seat and says, "The title page, the cover of this book is like wearing a red MAGA hat, and I can't do either." And that was kind of funny, but it was true. And I think, so if you write the book, and like I said, if you write a book and somebody calls you a Nazi, then the next time is you don't want to really write a book. That's the intent of that slur. And so I think a lot of people are afraid to come out and say that for all his warts, Donald Trump did something that traditionally better qualified, at least supposedly better qualified presidents had not been able to do. We hadn't had annualized 3% GDP since 2006. We never had record low unemployment among minority communities, or even peacetime unemployment quite this low in 70 years. So we were nobody ever thought we could increase oil production by 3 million barrels just in 2 years alone under Trump. And so there's things going on, I think, that nobody expected. I don't think any of the Democrats or traditional Republicans or never Trump thought that he would make such superb judicial appointments, not just that they're strict constructionists, but they're so well qualified. And so I think he's doing things, he's questioning everything. I mean, he's questioning, why should we give federal money when you don't enforce the Fourth and First Amendment on campuses? Why do you campuses push these federal loans down on these students that have $1.5 trillion in aggregate debt, while you charge them these sky-high rates, and then when they default, the government has to cover for them when you could cover for them as well, and you wouldn't do it. So he's asking questions that should have long ago been asked, but everybody was afraid to ask them.
Well, to that point, it was noteworthy that Trump himself said when he talked to the Chinese, they'd say, yeah, we know that the tariff situation is totally not a level playing field. They charge a lot. We charge almost nothing. And they said we kept expecting somebody to say something and ask it to change, but nobody ever did until Trump came along.
They didn't. No, they didn't. I can tell you that where I work at the Hoover Institution, the status quo among experts on China was, well, we're the post-war leader of the free world in the West, and so we're going to allow these infractions, they would call them, among Chinese traders and the government and companies, because this Tiananmen Square was just a speed bump on the way to Carmel, and the more money they make, the more we give them allowances, the more they're going to liberalize and eventually become a democracy. And Trump came along and said that's never going to happen. The more they're going to consider that magnanimity weakness to be exploited. Mm-hmm. And after he did that, it's just shocking to me to see people suddenly, where I work and elsewhere, say, hey, they don't treat religious minorities well. Hey, they're anti-democratic. Hey, their one-child policy is becoming Orwellian. Wow, they're harvesting body parts. And suddenly he was like that 2004 Apple commercial where the woman throws the sledgehammer in the screen and Big Brother just goes blank. And now suddenly it's okay to talk about China, as long as you don't mention that this newfound freedom to say the truth about China isn't because of Donald Trump. You never give him credit. you just say, I came up with this great idea that we got to get tough on China, but Trump had nothing to do with it. And that's pretty much true of a lot of his successes.
Mm-hmm. Let's close with a question which asks you to sort of take the 30,000-foot view of Trump and his presidency. Does Trump's ascent to the presidency mark the end of an era and the start of a whole new one? And more significantly even, has Donald Trump changed the way politics is done forever? Or is he just a bump in the road, an aberration?
Well, I think that the rise of Bernie Sanders and some of these left-wing versions of Trump starts to suggest there's a lot of people in the country, and we saw this cheating scandal about Ivy League and Stanford admittances. As an example, there's a lot of people in the country who believe now that this bi-coastal culture, this bragging about where you go to school and you're going to have this resume and this hipster type of lifestyle, there's something wanting in it. And the idea that an American in San Francisco would know more about Shanghai than Bakersfield, or an American in D.C. knows the streets of Paris better than he does York, Pennsylvania. There was something wrong there, and there was something amoral about writing off the interior, and you're not going to be successful unless you realize that lesson. I think that's changed. There's been a real pushback against unelected elites in administrative state, and that's worldwide now, from Brazil to Britain to Europe to streets of Paris. And the other thing is, I think we're going to be a little bit more careful in writing people off. We used to say, well, Ross Perot or third parties can't ever win, and they can't. But that doesn't mean that you can't have a third-party candidate within a traditional party. And when that happens, all bets are off. So I think that people are now saying maybe being a business person is better than having a JD from Harvard Law School. Or why do we always have presidents with Yale and Harvard Law degrees that never could function in the real world? I'd rather have a guy that runs a 7-Eleven that knows inventory and security and the business cycles and has to survive by his own hard work and acumen, rather than just getting it, lifelong tenure and then walking into government. So, yeah, that's changed, I think, and that's changed for the good, I think.
On that note, we thank you, Mr. Hansen, and wish you the best of success with this book, and hopefully it won't be read only by people that like Trump.
I hope not, although it might anger some people if it has reviewers, but I hope everybody reads it.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Victor Davis Hanson. The book is The Case for Trump. Well worth a read. Quick break, and then we're back to talk Jussie Smollett and Michael Avenatti.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now it is time for the portion of Liberty Nation Radio which we entitled Talkin' Liberty, as we welcome back LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor, our resident constitutional attorney and regular contributor to Liberty Nation Radio, Scott Cosenza. Welcome back, Scott. And let's start with a 16-count indictment against Jussie Smollett, including some very serious charges, simply wiped out by the Illinois State's Attorney Kim Foxx. Simple question. How could this possibly be?
It's good to have powerful friends, Tim. That's how this could possibly be. If you know the right people and you can get the right phone calls made, when corruption takes hold, and we know that Chicago is a place storied for its corruption, and it's ongoing to this day, and that's what this shows us. This is a corrupt act by Joseph Maggots, who is the elected prosecutor Kim Foxx's deputy. She recused herself after she soiled her own reputation by communicating directly with a Smollett family member and then asking the Chicago police to somehow transfer the case over to the FBI. Awkward enough in and of itself. But then we have Mr. Maggots' decision to drop the charges in this case. And that's where the corruption lies, and that's where people should direct their ire.
Well, now we hear that Jussie Smollett himself wants to sue. Question for you, Scott. Do you think that Mr. Smollett will try as hard to find the perpetrators of this crime
as O.J. did for the real killer of Nicole Simpson?
It's a natural question, Tim, with the combination of resources on maybe that will yield breaks in both cases when they really double down.
Yes, indeed. So what is the fall in legal circles? I want to know, what is the reaction in legal circles, because you follow this stuff, about this decision? What are you hearing? What's the chatter about this breathtaking decision by the Illinois State Attorney's General or state attorney's office? What's the reaction?
That somebody made a phone call. And that's what it is. And they have no shame. And that's the other thing, is that people are surprised that they have no shame. I mean, at least, Tim, you would say to Mr. Smollett, hey, don't go on TV and proclaim your innocence and make a mockery of it. You know, just go quietly out of the side door, for crying out loud.
Well, it makes you wonder, you know, Mr. Smollett is still holding to his story, which has been so thoroughly discredited. And I love the way, Scott, that the Chicago police released some documents, and then the Smollett attorney said, hey, you're not allowed to do that. That was sealed. And then they kind of went, oh, yeah, that's right. Sorry.
Yeah. You know, given the facts of this case, it's hard not to have a smile on your face when they do that. But at the same time, the Chicago police have historically been no friend to liberty. So I'd be careful about letting them get by with a wink and a nod under a court order. While Mr. Maggots dropped the charges against Mr. Smollett, he's stated quite clearly he doesn't believe that he's innocent of those charges. In fact, he believes that he committed the act. He just believed that the forfeiture of the $10,000 bond, along with some quote-unquote community service that Mr. Smollett performed, were good enough as a punishment, essentially.
Now, I've tried to figure a nice segue from Jussie Smollett into Michael Avenatti, and I thought of it this way, Scott. You know, Avenatti talked about running for president. What do you think about a Michael Avenatti, Jussie Smollett Democratic ticket to take on Donald Trump?
It's a little too white at the top of that ticket, and a little too male overall, Tim. Come on, this is 2019 here.
It must be my white privilege, Scott. Now, the foundational charge here is that he engaged in pretty massive extortion scheme that he demanded, what was it, $20 million?
Yes, and Tim, I think it's important to specify, why was this extortion rather than just some sort of legal demand? What separates this from, for instance, his former client, Stormy Daniels, threatened to expose private facts about the president, and she got a six-figure check for it? What's the difference? Well, the difference is there was actually a client. In other words, her attorney, Mr. Davidson, was acting on her behalf, not to enrich himself, and it was about the publication of private facts in some kind of a book form. That's not what happened here. Michael Avenatti somehow discovered these facts, alleged negative information about Nike and potential recruiting violations, and he had some client, and the idea was that he presented Nike the following. Nike would pay his client, I think it was $1 million or $1.5 million, and then they would pay him and his partner, Mr. Garagos, some $20+ million as a consulting fee. But the thing is, that was all bogus, Tim. It wasn't a consulting fee. It was just a payoff in order to bury this information, which Avenatti believed would hurt Nike's sale price, and which they would run to cover up. And that's what we have. That's why it's an extortionate plot. And that's why it's a federal crime.
Okay. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Tim.
This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcast, The Uprising, hosted by Scott, and The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose with LibertyNation.com managing editor Mark Angelides, are available to you on demand online at LibertyNation.com and from fine podcast providers everywhere. So that is it for this week, but we'll be back at you next week, same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying stand up for liberty, and we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.